The smoke hung thick in the rafters of Alistair Munro's cabin, swirling around dozens of meat strips suspended from poles positioned exactly 7 feet above the dirt floor. While his neighbors cursed the smoke in their own structures and built separate smokehouses that demanded constant tending, Alistair sat beneath his carefully engineered shelf system, watching the fire he had learned to control with precision, knowing his jerky would outlast theirs by months. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of frontier ingenuity like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale of mountain survival might just change how you think about simple solutions. The year was 1842. The Bitterroot Mountains of Montana Territory stretched white and merciless under a February sky that promised no mercy. Inside a small log cabin tucked against a pine-covered ridge, Alistair Munro knelt beside his partner's body and understood that everything he thought he knew about survival was wrong. Duncan Farquhar had been dead for 3 hours. The illness had taken him quickly once it started, a fever that burned through his weakened body in less than 2 days. But the sickness itself was not the killer. Starvation was. Their food stores had failed them when they needed them most. Alistair and Duncan had trapped together for 6 years. They were careful men, experienced men who understood the rhythms of mountain life. Every fall they hunted elk and deer, processing hundreds of pounds of meat into jerky using the methods every trapper knew. Salt the meat heavily, hang it to dry, store it in the cool darkness of the cabin. The technique had worked for generations of frontiersmen. It should have been enough. But this winter had been unpredictable. An early blizzard in October had trapped them in the high country longer than planned. By the time they returned to their main cabin in November, they were already drawing on their preserved stores. The meat looked good, smelled acceptable, showed no obvious signs of trouble. They ate it through December and into January without concern. The spoilage revealed itself slowly. First, a slight discoloration on some pieces, then a musty smell that grew stronger each week. By late January, more than half their jerky showed clear signs of mold and rancidity despite the salt curing. They trimmed away the bad portions and ate what remained, but it was not enough. Duncan, already weakened by a hard fall on the trap lines that had bruised his ribs, began losing weight rapidly. When the late February blizzard hit without warning, trapping them inside for 9 days straight, Duncan's body had nothing left to draw on. The fever came on the 7th day. He died on the 9th, hours before the storm finally broke. Alistair wrapped Duncan's body in blankets and waited for the snow to stop. When it did, he spent a full day digging through frozen ground on a hillside, overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for so many seasons. He marked the grave with stones and stood there as the sun set, looking at the mound of rocks that held his partner. The walk back to the cabin took 20 minutes. Alistair spent it thinking about the jerky that had failed them, about the preservation method that everyone trusted, about the simple fact that Duncan had died, not because the mountains killed him, but because their food had betrayed them. Spring came to the Bitterroots in late March of 1842. Alistair finished the trapping season alone, working the beaver ponds and creek lines with mechanical efficiency. His mind was elsewhere. Every night he returned to the cabin and looked at the remaining jerky hanging from a simple pole near the ceiling. Some pieces were still edible. Others showed the telltale signs of decay that had killed Duncan. He could not stop thinking about why some meat lasted and some did not. In early April, Alistair began visiting other trappers' camps. He told them he was checking on neighbors after the hard winter, but his real purpose was observation. He wanted to see how other men preserved their meat. Most trappers used one of 2 methods. The first was a separate smokehouse, a small outbuilding dedicated entirely to meat preservation. These structures required constant fire tending, were vulnerable to bears and weather, and demanded significant labor to build and maintain. The second method was simpler. Men hung meat inside their cabins on whatever poles or racks they could improvise, positioned wherever space allowed. The meat dried in the ambient smoke from cooking fires and heating fires. Sometimes it worked well, often it did not. Alistair noticed something during these visits. The smoke in every cabin behaved differently depending on where you stood. Near the floor, the air was relatively clear. At shoulder height, smoke drifted in thin wisps, but higher up near the ceiling, smoke accumulated in thick layers that hung like fog. He returned to his own cabin and began a series of deliberate experiments. He hung strips of fresh venison at different heights, 3 pieces at shoulder level, roughly 4 feet from the dirt floor, 3 pieces at head height, approximately 6 feet up, 3 pieces near the ceiling, about 8 feet high. He maintained his normal fire routine, cooking and heating as he always had, and watched what happened. After 2 weeks, the results were unmistakable. The meat at shoulder height had dried poorly, showing early signs of spoilage. The meat at head height was better, but inconsistent. The meat near the ceiling was noticeably superior, with deep smoke penetration and even drying. But the ceiling height presented problems. The meat was difficult to reach, requiring a ladder for every check. More importantly, smoke at the very top of the cabin was too hot, too close to where heat concentrated before venting. Some pieces showed slight cooking on the edges. Alistair realized he needed to find the specific height where smoke was dense enough for preservation, but not so hot it cooked the meat. He began measuring, observing the smoke patterns in his cabin at different times of day, with different fire intensities, under different weather conditions. He noticed that smoke did not rise in a uniform column. It rose hot and fast from the fire, then spread and settled as it cooled. There was a zone, roughly 7 feet above the floor in his 12-foot-high cabin, where smoke seemed to pool and circulate before continuing upward to vent. That zone, Alistair thought, was where meat should hang. Summer arrived, and with it the season when most trappers maximize their work, taking advantage of good weather to build wealth. Alistair Munro made a different choice. He decided to understand smoke. He started with fire types. A hot fire built from seasoned pine logs created intense heat and fast-rising smoke that shot straight up to the ceiling and out through the roof vents. The smoke moved too quickly to settle anywhere, passing through the cabin in seconds. Meat hung in the smoke barely absorbed anything before the smoke was gone. A low fire built from green cottonwood behaved completely differently. It smoldered rather than blazed, producing thick white smoke that rose slowly and spread as it climbed. This smoke lingered in the cabin, creating layers at different heights. Alistair could see the stratification clearly when sunlight came through the door. The smoke hung in distinct bands, thickest at certain elevations. He began measuring his cabin precisely. Floor to ceiling was 12 feet at the ridge pole, sloping down to 10 feet at the walls. The fire pit sat directly on the dirt floor in the center of the space. He marked heights on the wall, logs using charcoal, making lines at 1-foot intervals from floor to ceiling. Then he conducted systematic tests. He lit small bundles of sage and held them at each marked height, watching how the smoke behaved. At 3 feet, smoke dispersed quickly, pulled into the general air circulation of the cabin. At 5 feet, smoke began to linger slightly longer. At 7 feet, something changed. The smoke pooled and spread horizontally before continuing upward. At 9 feet, near the ceiling, smoke was hot and moved rapidly toward the vents. Alistair repeated these tests dozens of times over several weeks, using different fire types, different weather conditions, different times of day. The pattern remained consistent. 7 feet above the floor was where smoke concentrated most densely, while remaining cool enough not to cook. He tested temperature using wet strips of leather hung at different heights. At 3 feet, the leather dried slowly, barely affected by the fire's warmth. At 9 feet, the leather dried quickly and became stiff, almost cooked by the heat. At 7 feet, the leather dried at a moderate pace, warm but not hot. The physics became clear to Alistair, even though he had no formal education in such things. Hot air rises. As it rises, it cools and slows. Smoke carried by hot air follows the same pattern. In a cabin of specific dimensions with a ground-level fire, there exists a zone where rising smoke has cooled enough to spread and linger, but has not yet reached the peak where it vents outside. In his cabin, that zone was approximately 7 feet above the floor. That was where smoke was densest, where temperature was ideal for drying without cooking, where air circulation was sufficient to prevent moisture accumulation, but not so strong it dispersed the smoke. That was where he would build his shelf. Late summer of 1842 found Alistair Munro selecting trees with the care most men reserved for choosing a rifle. He needed straight pine poles, 8 feet long, uniform in diameter. He spent 3 days walking the forest slopes near his cabin, marking candidates with charcoal slashes on the bark. When he finally cut the poles, he stripped them completely, removing every bit of bark and smoothing the surface with his knife. Rough bark would create spaces where moisture could hide and spoilage could begin. Smooth wood would allow air and smoke to reach every surface of the hanging meat. His cabin already had vertical support posts, 4 thick columns running floor to ceiling that helped bear the weight of the roof structure. These posts stood in a rectangular pattern, roughly 8 feet apart, creating a natural framework. Alistair would use them as anchor points for his horizontal shelf system. The critical measurement was height. He marked each vertical post at exactly 7 feet 3 inches from the dirt floor. He had chosen this specific height through weeks of observation, determining it was the precise elevation where smoke pooled most densely in his particular cabin. 3 inches higher, and smoke dispersed too quickly. 3 inches lower, and smoke density dropped noticeably. Using a hand auger, he drilled holes through each vertical post at the marked height. The holes angled slightly upward to prevent the horizontal poles from sliding out under load. He had learned this technique watching barn builders in Kentucky years before, and it transferred perfectly to his purpose. He fitted the first horizontal pole between 2 vertical posts, sliding it through the auger holes. The fit was tight enough to hold firmly, but not so tight he could not adjust position if needed. He repeated the process, installing 3 parallel horizontal poles that spanned the cabin's width, each separated by 18 inches. The 18-inch spacing was deliberate. Closer spacing would restrict smoke circulation between the meat strips. Wider spacing would reduce capacity and create uneven smoke exposure. 18 inches allowed adequate airflow while maximizing the number of strips he could hang. To secure everything, Alistair wrapped each joint where horizontal poles met vertical posts with strips of wet rawhide. As the rawhide dried, it shrank and hardened, creating connections stronger than rope. He reinforced these further with wooden pegs driven through overlapping wraps. He tested the system by loading it with stones wrapped in leather, simulating the weight of a full load of meat. The poles flexed slightly but held firm. He added more weight, pushing the system beyond what he would ever actually load, still solid. The final touch was a simple ladder constructed from smaller branches lashed together with rawhide. It leaned against the wall beneath the shelf, providing easy access for hanging meat and checking progress. Alistair stepped back and examined his work. 3 parallel poles suspended exactly 7 feet 3 inches above the floor, anchored to structural posts, capable of holding hundreds of pounds of meat directly in the smoke concentration zone. The shelf was ready. Now he needed to perfect the fire. Building the shelf had been the easy part. Alistair understood that now. The real challenge was controlling the smoke itself, creating the exact conditions that would transform his precisely positioned poles into an effective preservation system. He began by repositioning his fire pit. For years, it had sat slightly off-center, placed wherever felt convenient when he first built the cabin. Now he moved it to the exact center of the floor space, directly beneath the middle horizontal pole of his shelf system. This ensured smoke would rise evenly toward all three poles rather than favoring one side. Fire type mattered more than he had initially realized. Seasoned hardwood, like oak or hickory, burned hot and clean, producing minimal smoke. Useful for cooking or heating, useless for preservation. He needed smoke, thick and continuous, without excessive heat. Green wood was the answer, but not all green wood performed equally. Alistair tested cottonwood, willow, alder, and pine. Cottonwood produced the densest smoke with the mildest scent. Willow was similar, but burned too quickly, requiring constant attention. Alder created acrid smoke that left a bitter taste on meat. Pine worked but produced resinous smoke that could overwhelm the meat's natural flavor. Cottonwood became his primary fuel, supplemented occasionally with willow when he needed slightly higher heat. He cut green branches thumb-thick to wrist-thick, lengths that would smolder for hours rather than blaze and consume quickly. The fire management technique he developed was specific and demanding. First, he built a base of hot coals, using small amounts of seasoned wood. This coal bed provided steady heat that would ignite the green wood without creating flames. Then, he added green cottonwood branches, one or two at a time, spacing them to allow airflow, but close enough they would ignite from the coals. The result was not a fire in the traditional sense. It was a controlled smolder that produced thick white smoke and moderate warmth. The smoke rose in a steady column, spreading as it reached the 7-foot level where his shelf waited. Maintaining this smolder required attention every 3 to 4 hours. Let it go too long and the green wood would dry out and begin burning hot. Add too much green wood at once and it would smother the coals, extinguishing the smoke entirely. Alistair developed a rhythm, checking the fire regularly, adding 1 or 2 branches as needed. He monitored temperature at shelf level using wet leather strips as indicators. If the leather dried and stiffened within an hour, the fire was too hot. If it remained damp after 4 hours, the fire was too cool. Properly managed, the leather should dry to supple flexibility in 2 to 3 hours. In early September, Alistair conducted his first full test. He hung freshly cut elk meat across all 3 poles, strips spaced evenly to allow smoke circulation. He tended his fire according to his developed method, maintaining the low smolder day and night. After 2 weeks, he examined the results. The meat was perfectly preserved, deeply smoked, showing no signs of spoilage. The system worked. October brought the first snow, and with it, visitors. Hamish Gilchrist arrived at Alistair's cabin on a cold afternoon, leading a pack horse loaded with beaver pelts. He intended to stay only long enough to warm himself before continuing to his own camp, 5 miles south. But when he opened the door and smoke billowed out in a thick cloud, he stopped. "Christ, Monroe, your chimney's blocked," Hamish said, stepping inside and waving smoke away from his face. "You'll suffocate yourself living like this." Alistair looked up from where he sat near the fire, adding a green cottonwood branch to the coals. "Chimney's fine. Smoke's supposed to be here." Hamish's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and he noticed the shelf system for the first time. Dozens of meat strips hung from the horizontal poles, wreathed in smoke. "What in God's name is that?" "Smoke shelf," Alistair said. "Built at the height where smoke concentrates. Preserves meat better than any method I've seen." Hamish walked closer, examining the poles and the precisely hung meat. "You built all this just to hang jerky?" "I throw a rope across my cabin and hang meat from that. Works fine, takes 10 minutes. "Where's your rope positioned?" "Wherever there's space. What does it matter?" "It matters because smoke doesn't distribute evenly. At 7 feet, smoke pools and circulates. That's where the meat needs to be." Hamish laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "Smoke is smoke, Monroe. Makes no difference if meat hangs at 6 feet or 8 feet or from the damn ceiling. You're making this complicated for no reason." Alistair stood and gestured toward the shelf. "My jerky from September is still perfect. No mold, no rot. How's yours holding up?" "Fine enough. I salt it heavy and smoke it 3 days, same as everyone." And by midwinter you'll have spoilage. I won't. Hamish shook his head. You're obsessing over Duncan's death. Building all this won't bring him back. Sometimes meat spoils. Sometimes men die. That's mountain life. He left without staying for coffee. Over the next few weeks, other trappers visited and had similar reactions. Broderick Strang came through and called the shelf system a waste of effort. I built my smokehouse in 2 days. You spent months on this for what? A trapper named Oswin stopped by and examined the setup with interest, then dismissed it. Too particular, too much fussing over measurements and fire control. Mountain men don't have time for that kind of precision. Some visitors tried to replicate what they saw. They installed poles in their cabins and hung meat from them. But they positioned the poles wherever convenient, at 5 feet or 9 feet or randomly spaced. They didn't control their fires, burning whatever wood was available with no attention to smoke production versus heat. Their results were no better than before, which confirmed their suspicion that Alistair's methods were unnecessarily complicated. By November, Alistair stopped explaining. He tended his fire, monitored his shelf, and watched his meat preserved perfectly while saying nothing. Winter settled over the Bitterroots in earnest by late November of 1842. Alistair entered the cold months with more preserved meat than he had ever stored before. Every available space on his 3 horizontal poles held jerky, venison, and elk cut into uniform strips, smoked to deep brown perfection. He maintained his fire constantly, the low smolder that had become routine. The dual purpose satisfied him in a way he had not expected. The same fire that warmed his cabin also preserved his food. 1 pile of green cottonwood, 1 careful tending schedule, 2 essential results. Living beneath the smoke shelf proved more comfortable than he had anticipated. The smoke concentration stayed at the 7-foot level and above. Below that, air remained clear enough for easy breathing. He cooked at his fire, slept on his raised platform, moved through his daily routines without the choking haze Hamish and others had predicted would make the cabin unlivable. Each week, he climbed his ladder and examined the meat. He checked for discoloration, tested texture, smelled for any hint of spoilage. Week after week, the jerky remained perfect. The smoke penetration was deep and even, creating a hard exterior that protected the interior from moisture and decay. By January, his oldest jerky was 4 months preserved. It showed no degradation whatsoever. He ate some to verify quality and found it excellent. The smoke flavor pronounced but not overwhelming. The texture firm but not brittle. Hamish Gilchrist appeared in mid-January, arriving during a brief break between storms. This time, he came asking rather than mocking. "What salt mixture are you using?" Alistair looked up from his fire. "Same salt I've always used, same as you." "Can't be. My jerky's showing mold at 6 weeks. Yours looks months old and it's still good." "It is months old. September meat, still perfect." Hamish examined the hanging strips more carefully, reaching up to touch one. "Must be the wood you smoke with. Some special type?" "Cottonwood. Willow sometimes. Nothing special." "Then what's the difference?" "The shelf height. 7 feet. I've told you this." Hamish frowned, clearly frustrated. "That can't be all it is. Height doesn't matter that much." Alistair added another green branch to his fire and watched smoke rise toward the shelf in a thick column. "It's exactly that much. Smoke concentrates at this height. Temperature is right, circulation is right. Everything works because the shelf is positioned precisely where the physics puts the smoke." Hamish left unconvinced, muttering about other variables Alistair must be using without sharing. But the seed of doubt had been planted. His own methods were failing while Alistair's succeeded, and salt or wood type could not explain the entire difference. Spring arrived in March. Alistair's jerky, some of it now 6 months old, remained completely edible. He had proven the system worked, at least to himself. Whether anyone else would accept the evidence was beyond his control. He had solved the problem that killed Duncan. That would have to be enough. The winter of 1843 arrived early and stayed late. Snow began falling in mid-October, unusual even for the Bitterroots. By early November, the mountain passes were blocked, trapping trappers in their scattered camps weeks before anyone expected. Most men had not completed their fall hunting and preservation. They had planned for another month of work before winter closed in. Instead, they found themselves isolated with incomplete food stores and months of cold weather ahead. Alistair heard nothing from his neighbors through November and December. Snow fell steadily, piling deep around his cabin. He maintained his fire, monitored his smoke shelf, and rationed his perfectly preserved meat. The jerky he had made in August and September remained flawless, now 4 and 5 months old. In early January, during a brief clearing, Angus MacLeod appeared at Alistair's door. He looked thin, his face drawn. "My family's in trouble. Our meat's spoiled. Most of it's gone bad, and we've got 3 more months of winter." Alistair stepped aside. "Come in." Angus entered and immediately noticed the smoke, the shelf system, the dozens of meat strips still hanging. "You've got stores. Enough to share. How many in your family?" "Wife and 2 children. I wouldn't ask, but they're hungry." Alistair climbed his ladder and began taking down jerky, selecting pieces from his oldest batch. The meat was 6 months preserved now, well beyond what standard methods could achieve. He filled a canvas sack and handed it to Angus. Angus held the sack, staring at the meat inside. "This is from last summer?" "August." "How? Our August meat was the first to spoil." "The shelf," Alistair said, gesturing upward. 7 feet exactly. That's where smoke concentrates in a cabin this size. Meat positioned there gets constant, dense smoke without excessive heat. Preserves longer than any other method. Angus looked up at the horizontal poles, studying their exact position. For the first time, someone was asking genuine questions instead of dismissing the system. "Why 7 feet specifically?" Alistair explained smoke physics as he understood them. Hot air rises and cools. Smoke follows the same pattern. In a 12-foot cabin with a ground-level fire, smoke pools densest at approximately 7 feet before continuing upward to vent. Temperature at that height is warm enough to aid drying, but cool enough to prevent cooking. "You're not just smoking meat," Angus said slowly. "You're engineering where the smoke goes and putting meat in that exact spot." That's exactly it. Angus spent an hour learning the details. Fire management, green wood selection, the tending schedule, the latter for regular monitoring. He asked about every aspect of the system, taking mental notes on measurements and techniques. Word spread quickly after that. Within 2 weeks, Hamish arrived asking for help, then Broderick, then others. Alistair shared his meat and his knowledge freely. Men who had mocked the smoke shelf now studied it carefully, finally understanding that the difference between survival and starvation could be measured in feet and inches. Spring of 1844 brought a wave of construction across the trapping camps of the Bitterroots. Men who had survived the crisis winter on Alistair's shared stores now built smoke shelf systems in their own cabins. Angus MacLeod completed the first replication in April. He followed Alistair's specifications exactly, measuring his own cabin dimensions and calculating where smoke would concentrate. His cabin stood 11 feet tall at the ridge, slightly shorter than Alistair's. He positioned his shelf at 6 feet 9 inches, adjusting for the reduced height while maintaining the same proportional relationship between floor, shelf, and ceiling. Alistair visited to inspect the work. The horizontal poles were properly spaced, securely anchored to vertical posts, positioned precisely in the smoke concentration zone. "You understood the principle, not just the measurement," Alistair said. "That's what matters." Angus hung his first batch of spring venison and managed his fire according to the techniques Alistair had taught. Green cottonwood, low smolder, constant attention to maintaining smoke without excessive heat. After 3 weeks, his jerky matched the quality of Alistair's. Hamish Gilchrist built his system in May, finally admitting what the crisis winter had proven. I thought you were mad, obsessing over measurements and smoke patterns. You were just being careful about things that actually mattered. His shelf went up at 7 feet 1 inch, nearly identical to Alistair's height. Hamish's cabin dimensions were similar enough that the same measurement worked. He struggled initially with fire management, burning too hot and creating smoke that dispersed too quickly. Alistair spent 2 days teaching him the discipline of the low smolder, showing him how to read smoke behavior and adjust fuel accordingly. By summer, 6 cabins in the region had functioning smoke shelf systems. Variations emerged based on individual cabin designs. Broderick Strang's cabin had lower ceilings, so his shelf sat at 6 feet 4 inches. Oswin built a larger structure and installed 4 horizontal poles instead of 3 to maximize capacity, but the core principle remained constant in every installation. Measure your space, find where smoke pools, position your shelf there. The technique eliminated the need for separate smokehouses. Men no longer spent days building and maintaining standalone structures. They no longer wasted fuel running 2 fires, one for living and one for smoking. The integrated system was more efficient, more reliable, and produced superior results. Alistair became known throughout the trapping community as the man who figured out the height. Trappers traveling through the region stopped at his cabin to see the original system and learn the principles. He explained the physics patiently, demonstrated smoke behavior, shared measurements, and fire management techniques. He never claimed ownership of the idea or asked for compensation. The knowledge had saved his life after Duncan's death. Now it was saving others. That was sufficient. By 1847, smoke shelf construction had spread beyond the Bitterroots into Idaho and Wyoming territories, carried by trappers who moved between regions and shared what worked. By 1848, the Rocky Mountain fur trade was collapsing. Beaver populations had been trapped nearly to extinction across vast regions. More significantly, fashion had shifted in eastern markets. Silk had replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying the demand that had driven men into the mountains for decades. Trappers began leaving the wilderness, searching for new opportunities in a changing West. Alistair Munro left Montana Territory in the spring of 1849. He was 46 years old, lean and weathered, from 15 years in the mountains. He had survived longer than most men in that brutal profession, and he knew when an era had ended. He packed his possessions, took a final look at the cabin with its smoke shelf system still intact, and rode west toward Oregon Territory. He settled on a small piece of land in the Willamette Valley, far from the mountains that had defined his adult life. Within a year, he had married a widow named Moira, who ran a boarding house in Salem. They built a modest farm, raised chickens and vegetables, lived quietly among neighbors who knew nothing of his previous existence. Alistair never returned to the Bitterroots. The man who had obsessed over smoke physics and preservation techniques became a farmer who worried about rainfall and market prices. He spoke rarely of his trapping years, and when he did, he never mentioned the smoke shelf or Duncan Farquhar's death or the winter that had changed everything. He died in August of 1871 at the age of 68. A brief obituary in the Salem newspaper noted his passing, mentioning his farm and his widow, but making no reference to his years in the mountains or any innovations in food preservation. But in the Bitterroots and beyond, the smoke shelf cabins remained. Settlers moving west along emigrant trails discovered abandoned trapper camps with strange horizontal pole systems positioned at precise heights inside log structures. Some recognized the superior construction and moved in, maintaining the systems and using them exactly as intended. Others studied the measurements and replicated them in new buildings. The principle spread organically through the frontier building community, men teaching sons, neighbors helping neighbors, the practical knowledge passing from hand to hand without fanfare or documentation. The phrase smoke shelf became standard terminology. Building inspectors in territorial towns began specifying shelf heights in construction codes for smokehouses and provision storage. Historians examining journals and letters from the period found occasional references to preservation techniques attributed to Monroe's method, or the bitter root height. Some documents mentioned 7 feet as a standard measurement for optimal meat smoking, though few explained why that specific number mattered. Modern estimates suggest the smoke shelf technique prevented food spoilage for dozens of families across multiple decades. The exact number of lives saved is unknowable, because successful preservation rarely generates written records. People simply survived winters, raised children, built communities, never knowing their food security depended partly on observations made by a grieving trapper in 1842. The innovation was never dramatic. No patents were filed, no fortunes made, no monuments erected. It was simply a better way of doing something essential, discovered through careful attention to how smoke behaves in enclosed spaces. Alister Munro's legacy was not carved in stone or written in books. It was built into measurements, into the knowledge that 7 feet mattered, into cabins scattered across the Rocky Mountains where meat hung at exactly the right height.